I found myself standing in front of a big black man at the London Correctional Institution in Columbus, Ohio. We were there with Gospel Echoes and their prison rally. And we spent the day on Friday grilling and serving and feeding the prisoners food like maybe many of you have helped with or been a part of. And we had agreed, my wife and I, to stay overnight and serve the next day in ministering to the inmates. And I remember that morning going into that facility, that correctional institution, and I told God, I said, God, do something with me today. I thought that I was filled, I was full, I was excited, and I was ready to give, I was ready to bless, I was ready to be used by God. But as soon as I walked into that door that morning, something changed inside of my heart, and I turned from full into empty. My motivation was gone, my excitement was gone. It was like taking an engine and setting it in 10 below degree weather, and the oil stiffens up and you can't move. You know what you should do, could do, what the others are doing, what's expected of you, but you just can't do it. It was kind of like I stiffened up and froze up and just nothing would go. It wasn't my first time in prison. That's how I felt the first time, by the way, because I was a nervous wreck. And so I found myself behind the worship stage as they were singing and ministering, worshiping, because I could not get myself to go out and minister to these inmates. And I was probably back there for about an hour, and all of a sudden, I saw a dear brother of mine just down the courtyard visiting with an inmate, and something supernaturally moved me from the spot I was at down to him. And as I stood there, I happened to look into the eyes of a very large black man, and the voice coming out of that mouth was a voice like you and I have never heard before. There was something supernatural coming out of his mouth, and the fire in his eyes was indescribable. And he looked at me and he said, I am here today for you. He said, you need what I have. That should have been me saying that to him. He was the inmate after all, wasn't he? I was there doing ministry, wasn't I? And he looked at me and he said, I have something for you today. He said, let me begin. He said, just so you know, he said, I'm serving a life sentence on a voluntary basis, and there's no parole. He said, I came into this prison several years ago because I turned myself in. He said there was a crime that was committed. He said, I'm from the state of Utah, and he said there was a crime that was committed in the state of Ohio, not far from this correctional institution. A very, very horrible crime. There was multi-murders and a house that was burned. And he said when that crime was committed, they never found the perpetrator. They never found the criminal. And he said, I went back to Utah and I lived my life. A few years after that happened, he said, I went back to the street. He said, I grew up, very, very rough neighborhood, very, very rough lifestyle. And he said, on the street, he said, I met Jesus. And I said, I found him and I accepted him as my Lord and Savior. My life changed. I started living the life of the Christian. He said, I went to the church and I thought everything was well until God stopped me one day. And he said, the most craziest thing to me that I've ever heard. He said, turn yourself in. He said, what? He said, turn yourself in. He said, so I got in a little car and I drove all the way from Utah to Ohio, to that little town where I'd committed the crime. And he said, all the way to Ohio, he said, you have never heard demons scream like you heard them scream on my way to Ohio. He said they were calling me names. They were telling me how stupid I was. The choice that I'm making is absolutely the worst thing I could do. He said the battle that I fought from Utah to Ohio is indescribable. He just said as I walked up the steps of the courthouse that day, he said it was deafening, the sound of the demons in my ears, convincing me and trying to talk me out of turning myself in. He said I walked up to the lady, the receptionist, and I told her I'm here to report a crime, and she said, is it a misdemeanor or is it a felony? She said it's a felony. He said, well, we have to have a detective present in order to receive the information that you have if it's a felony. So I waited a while in the waiting room, he said. And then in walked a deputy and a detective, and they took me back into a room where they were interviewing me, and they asked me the questions. And he said, Jeremy, he said, I asked them if they remember the crime that was committed on a so-and-so street, on a so-and-so block, on a so-and-so home, and absolutely. And he said, I looked at them and I told them, I know who committed that crime. And he said, you should have seen the attention. He said, their eyes opened, their notepads came up, and they were ready to take the information. And he said, did you ever wake up on an October morning when there was the first frost? He said, the house is stuffy and sultry from the humidity the day before. But overnight, the sultry air moves out. Your first cold air from the Canadian tundra moves in, and frost touches every blade of grass. And he said, the first thing you do, he said, the sky is blue, the sun is just coming up over the horizon. And he said, the first thing you do is you go over to that window, and he said, you pull up that window, and you stick your head out the window, and you go, take that first breath of crisp fall air. He said, that's exactly what it felt like when I looked at the detective and said, it was me. He said, the truth will set you free. He said it wasn't 30 minutes later I had handcuffs and shackles on my feet. I was let off to a cell. Shortly after that, I was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He said, God sent me here to serve life in prison for people like you. He said, God has a message for you today. He said, things aren't the way they should be where you come from. He said, there's much conflict going on. You can't get along with the people you're close to. You're facing situations in your church, you're facing situations in your home. And he said, let me tell you why. He said, I want you to look at this courtyard of this prison. He said, how many men do you think are gathered in this courtyard? I said, I don't know, probably a couple hundred. He said, yeah. He said, approximately 300 men are in this courtyard today. He said, now look, he said, look up at the facility. And this was down at London. If you guys have been there, you know what I'm talking about, with the big concrete courtyard. And there's a 3-sided facility with stories high. I would guess maybe 8 to 10, maybe plus stories high, of a huge brick building lined with windows. And he said, this facility holds over 2,000 men. He said, there's only 300 down here. He said, there's 1,700 men in their cells today, laying in their cots with their blankets pulled over their faces. He said, you know why? He said, no. By now, I was feeling this big, trembling a little bit. He said, because you're too late. I said, what do you mean? He said, Jeremy, he said, you are too late. He said, I grew up on the streets in Utah in a very rough section of town. He said, at 7 years old, I would watch my mother shoot heroin into the veins of her arms. And he said, where were you? He said, I watched my dad come home every night from the local bars and the slums of the streets in drunken rages, and I watched him beat my mom over and over and over again. And he said, where were you? Can you imagine how I felt then? Kind of like you're feeling right now. You're feeling right now what I felt at that moment. It's not a very good feeling, is it? looked me straight in the eyes with fire coming out of those dark pupils, and he said, "Where were you?" And he said, one night, in the most drunken rage, he said, "My father took my mother's life." And he said, "I hid behind the furniture and I watched the policeman come in and grab my dad and take him off, and I've not seen him since." And he said, "Where were you?" He said, "Because you weren't there, I went back out on the streets, and at 14 years old," he said, "I took my very first shot of heroin into my veins." And he said, "You weren't there." He said, "That's when I needed you." He said, "On either end of our street, there was a church." And he said, "We didn't know anybody that attended those church, but we heard rumors that they couldn't get along with each other. We heard rumors that you couldn't go inside of those churches because there was expectations that you needed to meet in order to be welcome there." So he said, nobody showed up. And he said, now, 30 years later, here you are. He said, those 1,700 men don't want to hear what you have today because you weren't there when they needed you most. He said, they're done. That day, friends, changed my life. Because as I sat there, as I listened to him, something else really hit me, friends. Where would Jesus be today? Do you think Jesus would be on some stage with a mic in his hand, preaching and teaching and doing worship songs? Or do you think maybe he'd be walking the corridors where 1,700 men have pulled the covers over their face and have given up? The man looked at me and he said, I need to pray for you. And he put his hand on my shoulder and prayed a prayer that I've never felt anything so dynamic before in my life. And he said, you go home. And he said, I know you do speaking. He didn't know me from Adam. He said, you do a lot of public speaking. And he said, that story, I want you to share every single place you go. That's why I'm sharing with you today. Because it changed my life. I grew up in a very typical home in the local area, as we all know. And when I say typical home, I mean a good home. I mean a home that is based on great foundation, a home that is what's wrong and right is being taught. We growing up in an Anabaptist culture, but when I say a typical home in the Anabaptist culture, I'm also telling you that there's a lot missing. Friends, I was a sensitive little boy that had a lot of emotional needs that didn't get met. Because of those emotional needs not being met, I made a lot of wrong choices. And by the time I was 8 to 12 years old, I was in trouble and into addictions, into a lot of things that 12-year-olds should not be involved in. The problem was I didn't have anybody to talk to. I couldn't share any of these things until I got married. I took all of that garbage and all of that debris into my marriage. And it caused a marriage that had a lot to be desired for. And my wife and I started seeking. We found healing and resolution. And our journey began that very day that I found freedom. God reached down physically, put his hand on my shoulder, and he called me into full-time ministry that day. I went home, we sold our property, we sold our home, we sold what we'd built, we'd sold what we loved, and we moved out of the community, the area, and the neighborhood that we grew up in, sold 2 businesses that I owned, and I committed myself to full-time ministry. And in ministry and walking with many, many, many people through conflict and seeking resolution, years of doing that, all of a sudden I started to pray and I said, God, what would keep us free? Why do we find freedom? Why do we find healing? Why do we have this amazing journey, but it only lasts for a short time? And God answered my prayer in London Correctional Facility that day. Friends, what I want to share with you today is the answer to maintaining your freedom. The answer to maintaining being free from conflict, whether it's your family, whether it's your church, whether it's your community, whether it's your workplace. The answer, friends, is Matthew 28. Because that inmate looked at me and he said, Jeremy, he said, go. We sat here about 15 minutes ago, 20 minutes ago, and we sang the song, I love to tell the story. Do you? I'm going to step on all of our toes a little bit right now. Every one of us sang that song. Do you really love to tell that story? It is so easy and comfortable to sing it in the shade trees right now, together. How many of us have told that story this last week to somebody that hadn't heard it? We're too late. Somewhere last week, there's a 14-year-old son that watched his drunken father beat his mother. Somebody should have told him the story. Where were we? Friends, God has placed it on my heart so strongly today that telling that story is the way we maintain our freedom. Telling that story is what resolves conflict in our lives.